All right, welcome everyone to the International Women's Day panel on female incarceration. I would like to first start off with our land acknowledgement. So the law school is on the traditional lands of indigenous peoples, including the Sellies, Kasanka, Calypsi, many others, including Blackfeet, Nez Perce, Shoshone, Bannock, and Coeur d'Alene, had and continue to have a crucial presence in the area. We acknowledge the role the legal system has played in the removal of indigenous peoples from these lands, and through our commitment to education, service, and scholarship, strive to improve the quality of justice for future generations. Doing so demands respect for tribal sovereignty and indigenous cultures, as well as accountability to the needs and perspectives of indigenous peoples, who, from time immemorial to the present and until the end of time, protect and remain connected with this land on which we gather, learn, live, and work. My name is Daniel Horton, and I am the president of Montana's Black Law Student Association. I'm also joined by Vice President Alexandra Jansen, Secretary Javon McMillan, Treasurer Derek Graves, 2L Rep Alex Strucy, 1L Rep Dion Che. Our mission is through advocacy and scholarship. We aim to increase the number of culturally responsible Black and minority attorneys who excel academically, succeed professionally, and positively impact Montana and the legal community. And so with that being said, without further ado, I would like to pass it on to our moderator for today, who will introduce our panelists as we proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm Katy Stack. I'm the Director of Career Development here at the Blewett School of Law. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to the student groups for putting this together. I know that you have spent a lot of time and energy doing it, and I'm very excited to be moderating our panel today. The reason I'm so excited is this topic is near and dear to my heart. I'm a former criminal defense and child advocacy attorney. So before I joined the law school last year, I represented incarcerated women and foster children who were often in the system due to their parents' incarceration. So I dealt with these issues frequently in my law practice, and they're very important. I'm glad that we're doing this panel today. I'm so excited to announce our panelists that are joining us from New York, Long Island, I believe. At least Clover, you're from Long Island, and we'll find out where Shawanna is from. Shawanna Vaughn is the founder and director of Silent Cries Incorporated, a social advocacy organization for the disenfranchised with a focus on improving the mental health for the incarcerated and formerly incarcerated. She's currently working on legislation to that effect that we'll hear about today. Also joining us is Ms. Clover Perez. Clover is the founder and executive director of A Beautiful Heart Ministries, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to improve the quality of life for formerly incarcerated women and girls. Clover is a Justice Scholar at Columbia University and an ambassador of the Susan G. Komen Foundation. Both of our panelists are formerly incarcerated women who have used their experience in prison to advocate for much needed change within the prison system. They're each going to share their stories about their time in prison and the impacts of incarceration on their life, as well as their advocacy efforts that they have engaged in. For anyone who has questions, if you could please put them in the chat, and I will monitor those and address them to our panelists as they come in. So I'd like to start by just asking our panelists, we'll start with Shawanna. If you could just tell us about your time in custody, what led you to be incarcerated, tell us about your sentence, where you did your time, and most importantly, what the experience in custody was like for you.
Absolutely. First, I'd like to say thank you to Montana Law School for the fortitude of putting this conference together. I was sentenced in Valley State Prison for Women in Chowchilla, California. I am from Bakersfield, California. I went to prison at 17. My sentence was 5 years with 85% and a stripe. And I did my time at Valley State Prison for Women. And The totality of prison is hard to grapple with because at 17, no child should be in an adult situation. And nothing I've ever done in my life equaled the sentence of prison. And so not only was it a harsh place, but it was mentally debilitating. And I am still suffering what prison looks like. When I got to prison, they gave me a bedroll and told me to go stand in the medication line. At 17, I didn't even take medication. They gave me Elavil to go to sleep and Ritalin to stay awake all day. And I was like, I know this can't be right. And so, there's demerits and you get written up for not taking medication. And I did not take medication. And I had to go get court to say I didn't need medication. And not everybody has the ability to do that. And so I learned in a few months that prison was very dangerous for my mental health, my physical health, and it took a toll on my life. And I'm still wearing the toll right now. I woke up every morning at 4:30 being called a cunt and a bitch, and I didn't even know what those words really meant in that moment, but I understood that men were dehumanizing, and I did not understand that when I was free. But the minute they locked the gate and they put me on D yard in Valley State Prison, I understood that I was no longer a human and I had no value, that I was a number. I was W76337. And I was told daily that I was not a human. I was something other than, less than. And that actually is a lasting effect on your mind and what people call you daily and how people treat you. So for me, being in prison was more than I could do. And it has definitely taken a toll on my mental health and my physical health. I have, suffered really bad lung problems, and speaking to an environmental doctor, he has traced my problems going back to prison and the conditions of prison. And I watched The Belly of the Beast, and I was in the prison that I'm watching, and even that was emotional because you have to grapple with all the women that suffer and are still suffering. And so I'm still healing and rebuilding from 4.5 years of Valley State Prison for Women Correctional Institution from the state of California.
Thank you, Shawanna. Clover, could we hear your story as well?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm super excited to be here and to engage with you all. My prison sentence started in April 2011 when I was convicted, jury trial to 10 years in federal prison. I was immediately remanded and sent to Brooklyn Detention Facility where I stayed there for 13 months. I stayed there for 13 months only because my judge that tried my case sat by jurisdiction. They did not want a judge from New York to try my case because my charge was immigration charge and they felt like I may have had connections to federal judge. So I was charged for immigration charge, identity theft fraud in the sense that I was charged for using my client's information to put it on applications and submit that application to immigration. And also it was just 5 different charges outside of that. One of the charge also was conscious avoidance. That means that I knew that my client submitted fraudulent application and I turned a blind eye and submitted to immigration. So this actually started, this program actually started in the early 80s. I was not doing immigration work at that time. Immigration had put out an amnesty for people that were in the country in the early 80s that did not have a green card. What they allocated was 500 green cards, but they did not state that they only had 500 green cards to give out. So they had an influx of people applying for this particular program. And they closed the program. A lot of people lost their money. And so they had a lawsuit. They sued immigration, and it was ruled that they had to either open up the program or refund the money. So they decided to open the program. And they reopened the program back in 2004. And that's when I started actually doing those applications. And I submit the application to immigration. I knew some of them were fraudulent. Nonetheless, I submit them only because I couldn't go according to my suspicion. If I didn't submit the application, I still would have been arrested. So I submit the application, and immigration was doing the same thing. They weren't giving anyone any green cards. So there was a complaint that immigration was doing the same thing that they did before. Immigration came back with a statement that no, they're not, that the preparers are submitting fraudulent applications. And that's when an investigation opened up, and I was arrested along with 65 other attorneys, preparers, and I went to trial with my case and was found guilty, as I said, and immediately remanded and went to MDC Brooklyn, that's the detention facility. I stayed there for 13 months and was sent to Danbury Federal Correction Facility. I stayed there for 8 months and then sent to the camp, which is right up the hill. And I stayed at the camp for 6.5 years and finished up the remaining of my sentence at a halfway house. I came home March 7th. Yesterday made 2 years since I've been home, March 7th of 2019. So my time in prison was basically very difficult. That was my first time in prison, and very, very traumatic. Entering to prison and just having someone telling you that you had to take off your clothes, squat, bend over, lift your breasts, cough, while they do inventory of your body to make sure that you had no contraband. That was very, very, very difficult for me. I have never experienced anything like that. Just being shackled, the feet around the waist, and just put into a bus while officers sit in the front and sit in the back with a gun. That was very, very difficult. And just entering to the facility, I just felt that I was going to die, that someone was going to actually kill me, because my point of reference about prison was what I saw on TV. So I was expecting that to happen to me, but thank God it didn't happen to me. And once I left Danbury Correction Facility, that's the facility that had the fence around, and went to the camp, I will say that my transition there was much more easier, only because there was a different set of people there, mostly for white collar crimes, and the respect level was different. I was a little bit acclimated, so there were certain things that I demanded, which was respect from the officers. I did not like to be identified as inmate Perez. I did not like to be called a number, because I am more than a number. So it took me a while for me to answer to that name. Eventually, I would say probably about 6 months after that, they started calling me Miss Perez. And from there on, things, just kind of went smoothly for me.
Thank you, Clover. So even though you were convicted of a white collar crime, you were sentenced to 10 years in federal custody.
Yes. And what I saw when I went to Danbury is that they had other individuals there, the same crime I was charged for, which was the amnesty program, but they did not go to trial. They had a year and a day. Some had 3 years, some had 2 years because they took a plea. But if you don't take a plea with the federal government, I think Shawanna was in the state, I was in the federal, you get penalized for that. So my sentence was 10 years.
Wow. Well, thank you both for sharing your experiences. That's really valuable insight for our students. I'd like to discuss any mental health treatments that were available while you're in custody. Maybe we could start with you, Shawanna. Were there any mental health options while you were in custody?
Absolutely not. Not only was there no mental health treatment, I felt like they were uh, purposely trying to derail people's mental health. When you have big pharmaceutical companies who are making billions in prison off of people that are incarcerated, I watch people come into prison not on pills, not uh, mentally challenged. And over the course of the 5 years, there were people who could not even say their name. There were people who looked like you see people at the methadone clinic. They're leaning, they're slumped over. They're just not falling down. The same thing you see on the streets in economically challenged, oppressed neighborhoods is the same things that I watched in prison because of the med line. So not only are we not addressing mental health, we are actually creating a mental health pandemic upon release with no regard for women's lives. The fact that people go home to children. And I think that is the thing that stuck with me most was that they created mental illness. Prison is a breeding ground for mental health disparities. And I'm very clear that prison is not the solution for mental health. It is not the solution for correction because anything that punitive cannot be rehabilitated or correctional. So absolutely unequivocally, there is no mental health resources but a mental health deficit and a mental health pandemic is created inside of prison.
It sounds like there was actually some forced medication going on at your facility then.
Oh, there's forced medication going on around the country every day because big pharma is in prison. And so, you hear people talk about trials, right? Well, who's telling you who the trial studies are on? The first place I saw Viagra was prison in the 90s. And so they're using prison as guinea pigs. They're using prison as test people. And we are no further than back in the day with people who were just used as experiments. We're still being used as experiments. And nobody is screaming out. We have more sympathy and compassion for dogs and cats at the SPCA than we do for humans being incarcerated in this carceral system. And, the movie in itself was good to explain that there is no mental health services. It is a mental health breeding ground and a death camp. That's basically what prison has left with me.
Thank you, Shawanna. Clover, what was your experience on the federal side?
Well, I echo Shawanna. There is no mental health care at all. There is addiction, basically, because at the camp, I came across a lot of individuals that actually came in that were addicted to some form of substance abuse or may be dealing with some type of mental problems. So what that would look like is that they will go to see the PA. The PA would prescribe medication. So if you're dealing with anything at all, that's the normal course. They would prescribe some form of medication. Women, they slept all day. They would wake up only to eat and then go back to sleep. So it was more so of creating addiction in prison than to make sure that someone, look at you or even have a conversation with you or even, just sit down and find out what your issues are. They don't do that. They send you to the PA's office and you are given some form of medication.
And how about your physical health? What was the toll on your physical health? And was there any, I know that the film talked quite a bit about sterilization and just the lack of any sort of physical care for inmates. What was your experience in terms of that?
So there's a lack of compassion, a lack of empathy in prison, especially for Black or brown people. There's just totally a lack. The staff members are usually desensitized, and they just treat you as a number. So there was no proper medical care. I remember I had actually twisted my ankle. I tore the ligament from the bone, and I was not sent out to get an x-ray. I was not even looked after. So it actually healed, and it healed incorrectly. Now I'm dealing with that now that I'm home because it wasn't taken care of. Sometimes also you have to pay a copayment. And if you don't have that $2 copayment in your account, they will not see you at all until you have that money in your account. So medical care is for the birds at Danbury, where I was at.
And Shawanna, was that your experience as well in terms of medical care?
Absolutely. For me, my eyes started to go bad in prison, and for the lack of an ophthalmologist or even a good optometrist, I now am legally blind. Um, I came home legally blind, and because they leave everybody untreated, and so stigmatisms turned into keratoconus, and now I have degenerative corneas, and so absolutely prison is neglectful. But meanwhile, at Valley State Prison, we made glasses for lens crafters and other small eyewear places. So in prison, imagine that you work in optical eyewear and you're the person going blind, or you're the person who has less than 20/20 vision and you're like 100. And the teacher can read you your new vision, but you can't get glasses. And you can't see an eye doctor, but you make glasses that are mailed out to people all over the country. That's the irony and sheer neglect that I was able to make glasses, but I was the person who could not see. And when I no longer was useful for that job, they sent me to go make hair dye because I can no longer see to put the pieces together. And so, yes, it actually takes a physical, mental, emotional toll, and the physical tolls are long outlasting the prison sentence. Prison was 5 years. My eyesight still was not better.
In terms of the work that you had to do, I know some of my clients had jobs that paid them things like $40 a month when they were working 20 or 30 hours a week. Were you paid at all for your work in the prison?
They call it PIA, and they give you, I think it's like $1.40 an hour.
And that money goes in your commissary account then?
Yes. Yes, that goes towards your commissary. So it would end up being, I think I made for the month, I think I made like $9 and change. And so if you take $9 and change, and toothpaste was $2. So if I did not have my own money, I would be considered indigent. And so you're working 8 hours a day, all these hours for no money. But what I did realize is when I got to New York in 2009, I had to apply for disability. They explained to me at Social Security that I had worked all these years, and they had my jobs down on the paper. And it said I worked for Lens Crafters Eyewear, and I made the sum of like $19,000 back then. And so then I realized that I was like, this is not possible. Every prison job I had was actually being counted against my Social Security, and I was in prison. So when you don't even realize until you are free the cost of slave labor and the penalties of it. So every job I ever had was listed. It said I worked at a cosmetology. I did landscaping. All these are prison jobs. And so they're vendors. And so it's just like going to a temp agency. So you wrote me in as a real temp and you really filed taxes on my behalf, but you paid me like a slave. And we're not still in 2021 addressing that in the incarceration system either. And I realized that a lot of people didn't even know that these jobs are being counted as real jobs when you got paid pennies on the dollar.
Wow. Were there any tax consequences for you then because they had attributed this work to you?
Absolutely. So when my health is at the point where they said, you could apply for SSD, which is disability, they said you can only have this because you worked enough in your lifetime. I was like, I never got any of what you're telling me. And I went back to challenge the state of California, and it was a shut door. And it's too late to sue, too much time has gone by. And I said, but how do we vocalize that this is happening to people all across the country? And this should be illegal. This should be abolished.
Absolutely. Clover, did you work while you were in custody?
Yes, I did. I worked in the education department. I also worked in the law library and also the library. My monthly salary was $5.35 a month. And there are so many people that I, like myself, have fine to pay. And if you don't have the money in your commissary account to pay that fine, your salary, your monthly salary, is held so it can pay your fine. And that was my last pay. I initially started off with $3.20, but there is months that I actually went by and don't get paid because BOP just didn't have the money to pay. So we work and we never got paid.
Wow, it's incredible. Well, I'd like to turn now to hear more about each of your organizations and the advocacy efforts that you've been engaged in since your release. Clover, since we have you, could you tell us a little bit about your organization?
Yes, definitely. So my organization name is A Beautiful Heart Ministry, and we say that our mission is driven, our vision is vast. We exist to eradicate mass incarceration of women and girls, to remove the veil of indivisibility that surrounds these women and girls, and to just bring them to the forefront of the conversation. You know, when we think about prison, we oftentimes think about men, but we fail to understand that the United States of America not only maintain the highest incarceration rate, they maintain the highest female incarceration rate. Actually led to my work, it started initially within my last 2 years in Danbury. I saw a lot of women and young girls going home and they were returning, and I couldn't understand why they were coming back to prison when I wanted so much to go home. So just being inquisitive, I started asking questions. What I found out was that a lot of these women and girls were returning back to prison because they had no resources outside, on the outside. Many of them had spent years in prison and did not have the support system on the outside, did not have money really to take home. So they lack the necessity. You know, one of the things that with the federal prisons that you have to finish up your remaining time in the halfway house, and then you're transferred to home confinement. Many of them didn't have a home. And so what that looks like is if you go into the halfway house and you are required to have a cell phone, which they do not provide. If you don't have the money to buy a cell phone, so when you leave the halfway house to go look for a job, you have to call the halfway house when you leave your destination and when you're returning. If you don't have a cell phone, automatically you're going to be written up and sent back to prison. If you don't have the money to buy clothing to go on a job interview, you're going to be written up and sent back to the halfway house. So that really prompted me to really say, you know what, I need to change that. So basically, I started my organization to help women coming home from prison, to help them get the resources that they need so their reentry will not be difficult, that they would not be written up, that they would, make sure their transition is easy when they come home. So that was the gist of my advocacy in prison, and just the fact that I felt so really so bad for these women when they were coming back to prison. I felt so bad for them. Many of them actually left their children home. So I do the work. I'm so passionate about the work. I also started Clover Perez Justice Reform Show, and it's a radio show on Genesis Radio where I allow these individuals to come on and share their story. Many of them are so broken. Many of them live in a trauma-induced lifestyle. They know nothing else but trauma because they suffer trauma from going into prison. They suffer trauma before going to prison, and they suffer trauma coming home. So I have a curriculum which I created in while I was incarcerated. I teach that curriculum right now to justice impact women and girls at the Brooklyn DA's office. And I also teach that curriculum also to other organizations because I want to make sure that every woman and every girl coming home from prison have everything that they need. Because if you operate in a trauma-enforced life, that's all you know. Every decision that you make is going to be led by that. And then the likelihood of you going back to prison is going to be very high. So I try to work around that. I make sure that if they need to go to the doctor, I make sure that my organization have the money to send them to the doctor. If they need to pick up a prescription, I make sure that my organization have the money to pay for that prescription. I don't ever want it to be that these barriers come up against them and become impediment that they return to prison. So, because I know how it feels to be in prison, but I was grateful that I had that support system when I came home, but many of these ladies don't have that support system. And it breaks my heart that Simple thing as clothes, toiletry, you don't have, and those things lead you back to prison.
Yeah, it really seems like having a support system in terms of family or friends on the outside is almost key to success in reentry. Without that, it seems like the system sets people up for failure.
Oh, absolutely. I just think it is a setup because it's a money-making thing. It's a money-making thing. They want people, they talk about recidivism rate, but in actuality, they want people to come back to prison. And one of the things that I found out, which I did not know, that in the federal prison, they have these bonds on every single individual that is incarcerated. They call them junk bonds. So there was a junk bond under my name. There was a junk bond under everyone else that is in the federal prison. I don't know how it works for the state. So they make money on us. So they want to keep us in prison. They want us to come back because it's a money-making thing.
It's unbelievable. Shawanna, could you tell us about your organization and your advocacy efforts?
Absolutely. So Silent Cry was founded out of my own silent tears. I can only fight for what I know. I was born in prison, then to the foster care system, and at 17 back to prison. I fight for mass incarceration, foster care, and gun violence. And my brother was murdered. My father was a cop. I run the gamut and my life is interesting, but all of that formulated Silent Cry because I understand that we are silently crying, and for a woman of incarceration, we're invisible. And I no longer want women to be invisible. I no longer want children of the foster care system or victims of violent crime to be invisible. So I definitely answer the cries of those who are silent and give them voice and make them visible. I believe my organization believes in redemption through optic lenses. Right now, my biggest push is my legislation. It is called Post-Traumatic Prison Disorder Shawanna W76337. I have the only mass incarceration mental health bill in the country. And I am asking that we take mental health as it stands, which is none, and we do a holistic approach to healing and alternatives to medication. And I'm asking that, that we give correctional officers that they be mandated to therapy. Because to work in an environment of such magnitude on a daily basis, they succumb to being an oppressor. They have the highest rate of domestic violence at home and at work, and they need therapy too. And in order to create a holistic environment, everybody has to be well. And, we are quick to give medication. I am quick to say there are ways to heal before and past medication. I believe in art. I believe in writing. I believe in music. I believe in so many other forms of therapy that are not medication. And so I'm advocating for, therapy after prison, that people leave with Medicaid cards, that people leave with a psychosocial, they leave with a plan. Because so often we send people home from prison, $40 in a bus ticket, and we say, live your best life, make it to parole, get a job, and do all these things. If you are not mentally well, and nobody ever prepared your mind, and nobody ever dealt with your trauma, you are going to go right back into recidivism because we never dealt with your trauma. And so that my legislation wants to not deal with the punitive action, but the root of the tree, which is the trauma that got you to prison in the first place. Because if we heal the trauma, we heal a family, we heal a community, and we ultimately heal a nation. And we don't know who our neighbors are going to be. So I'm definitely asking that each one of you, as going to be public defenders, going to be criminal defense attorneys, that you support this legislation, because mental health is an epidemic that we have not addressed, and it is one of the main factors to mass incarceration. And I just think that if we try a new approach, our country will be better for it. And so will you as prosecutors and defense attorneys and upcoming lawyers. So I'm asking that you please support post-traumatic prison disorder Shawanna W76337.
Thank you. That sounds like really important legislation. Is there a specific way that folks can do that, or is that information you could perhaps provide to Alex and I that we could spread to the audience?
I can definitely provide, and you can share to the audience, but ways to assist is I definitely need people to amplify the message on social media. Hashtag, I definitely need people that want to volunteer to make phone calls, to write letters, to help do the work. It takes financial capital to run legislation. I would love for your law school to say you would partner with the legislation to amplify the voice even in your state. Because allies are key in legislation. People pass legislation. And so legislation has to be for us, by us, and amplified by all. But I will definitely send you something that you can share. And I definitely want all the support that I can get.
Thank you. Clover, are there ways that we can take action with your organization, or do you have any advice for our students in terms of advocacy efforts that they can make?
Yes, thank you. That's a wonderful question. As a woman that serves a woman, it is so important to understand that woman does not belong in prison. That there need to be some form of alternative sentence for women. There are a lot of women that are entering prison right now that are broken women. And I would love for your organization to advocate for women from not going to prison. Advocates for children, not children, young girls not going to prison. That's not where they belong. I see that there's a lot of school that's pushing kids into the juvenile system because they don't understand them. I remember, before I get to your question, I remember when my son was 11 years old and he was having problems in school. They wanted him to take medication. And I tried the medication. And they come up with all different ways. Well, we cannot handle him. Probably you need to get him into military school. Probably you need to do this and you need to do that. But when I looked at my son, he was like a zombie. And looking back now, he's no longer here because he was killed 8 months before I went to prison. So I had to deal with that trauma. That's why I fight for women. I fight for women every single day because we have our children. We have our mothers. We have our husband. We have our sisters. We have our brothers home. We are not the worst mistake we ever made. There need to be other ways of punishing someone for a crime that they committed, especially a non-violent offender, from going to prison. You can read more about the work that I do at my organization, which is abeautifulheartministries.org. I'm also on social media under A Beautiful Heart Ministries and also Clover A. Perez. I will continue to champion for women, to prevent them in any way possible, for them not to go to prison, not to experience what I experienced, not to experience what Shawanna experienced. My heart broke when I heard Shawanna's story, knowing that she went to prison when she was 17 years old, leaving her family. When she cries, who is there for Shawanna? When she misses her family, who's there for Shawanna? How is it that a 17-year-old is supposed to figure out how to deal with prison? We need, as a country, we need to look at what is going on, why we need to send someone as young as Shawanna to prison. That's what we need to. And if we look at things like that, then we can eliminate mass incarceration, because women and young women do not need to be in prison, especially if they are nonviolent offenders. Thank you.
Thank you, Clover. One of my final questions, The Belly of the Beast is the documentary that we all watched prior to this event, and that discussed illegal sterilization of women in California's prison system. Were you able to watch the film, Clover?
Yes, I watched a small part that you sent to me. Well, someone sent it to me. Alexander, I think, sent it to me. So it's just a small part. But yeah, I watched it and it broke my heart. But it also shows, you know, how women, especially Black and brown women, how we are being treated. You know, this is coming, this is not something that's just happening. This is coming from slavery. Our body is not valued at all. Woman is not valued. So it's easy for them to do something like that to us. And as a matter of fact, any woman right now that goes to prison is easy because we are not valued. The moment that we are convicted of a crime, we are no longer valued. We are dehumanized. We are marginalized. We are treated as the lowest of the low. We're not even, our name is not even valued. We are given a number that says that we're not human. If you can't look at me and call me by my name, that means that you don't look at me as a person.
Yeah, I think the film definitely touched on that. Shawanna, what was your reaction to the film?
I had to do it over a few times because for me it was more than a movie. You showed a place I lived for 4.5 years. I saw women that I remembered in that video. And I cried because I realized that when you ask for too many sanitary napkins, they would send you to the gynecologist. And I remember one of my roommates explaining to me, don't ask for any more pads because they're gonna fix you. And when you're 17, 18, and 19, you're not clear what that is. And no adult wants to explain to a child what they're telling you. Not only was Valley State Prison for Women a death camp for minority women's wounds, there was no reparations to those women. Like they said, there was no apologies, there was no money, there was nothing. Because as W76337, whatever your number was, you're not even a human and you're property of the state. And the state doesn't feel like they own you. They're sterilizing you, using you. Nobody dared to ask how many women didn't make it off the table. How many women never made it back to their room? How many women hemorrhaged and died? Belly of the Beast made me call my therapist because I realized that everything is a trigger and a trauma. And Belly of the Beast is something that I'm going to have to really sit down and grapple with because that is a reality that I sat in. That is a reality that women on the border right now in detention centers in 2021 are being sterilized because they're not human, and because they're black and brown and they're innocent. Their bodies are not their own and they do not count. When do we scream like we scream for animals? Where is the call for women? We are in Women's History Month, but we need to scream 365 days a year for gender equality. And if we don't care enough to scream for women that are in prison and in detention centers, well, when they take back Roe versus Wade out here, everybody's screaming. What about people that are inside? Even though you're going to be attorneys fighting for, and it's still something you need to champion. And it's never forgetting what a woman is and what we stand for and what we represent. We give birth. We create earth. And so if we can realize that all women matter, then we'll start writing the congressmen and the legislators, and we will start talking to the prosecutors about alternatives to incarceration and sending people to death. Because these are just new plantations and extensions of slavery, no better than death camps in the Holocaust. We're just doing different things that are still inhumane. So that is what Belly of the Beast meant to me: inhumanity, dehumanization, and trauma.
Well said, Shawanna. Well, I'm afraid we have reached the end of our time here today. We do have a second panel beginning at 5 o'clock in 5 minutes. I want to thank Shawanna and Clover for their time and for sharing their stories with us. Such a valuable perspective for all of us to understand where you're coming from and the inspiring advocacy efforts that you're both making. And I encourage all of our students, Alex has put information in the chat about both of these organizations as well as Shawanna's legislation. So please check that out and help them out as you see fit. Yeah, we were getting a lot of thanks in the chat. Thank you both so much. We're just going to take a quick 5-minute break. You can remain in the Zoom here, and we'll get going with our second panel here at 5 o'clock.
I did want to, if I could, say something for a quick moment.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so, you know, in hearing your stories, it really reminded me of 13th and the panel that we held earlier in February, because a central theme of that was dehumanization. And through many of my friends growing up and hearing their experience, it reiterates that the entire jail and prison induction process is like some ritualistic dehumanization process. I mean, just imagine your job or your college or university telling you that you're no longer recognized by your name, but your student ID or your employment ID number, you know? And so I really just wanted to thank you for coming on here and sharing your story in your organization, because it seems like America is still giving out bad checks, whereby the promissory note, which every American was to fall heir, is still being reneged upon. And so I just wanted to really get that out there before we go to our break and enjoy our free moment. But I just wanted to thank you all for what you've done. And I'll definitely reach out and see how we can work together in the future.
Thank you so much. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation. I have another Zoom that I have to be on at 7, so I really appreciate it and thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank you both so much. I'll be sure to, I can send you the recording as well, and I'll
Okay.
follow up after this too.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Christina, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, I'm gonna try and do this breakout room situation.
I just started one, so.
Never mind. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everybody. We're returning now from our break for our second of two panels on women and incarceration on International Women's Day. My name's Katy Stack. Again, for those of you who did not join us on our previous panel, I'm the Director of Career Development here at the Blewett School of Law in Missoula. I'm very excited to introduce our panelists for our second panel here. We have Professor Lisa Pasco. She's at the University of Denver. We have Katie Carpenter, who is the legal director of the Montana Innocence Project and actually works here in the building with us. We have Professor Barbara Baumgartner from Washington University. And I believe, if not at this point, we may have a special guest joining us. We've just been in contact with her today. Cynthia Chandler, who's the Justice Now director, and she was the featured attorney in the Belly of the Beast film that I believe many of you watched. She heard about our panel and offered to join us this afternoon, which was really exciting. So with that, I'd like to open it up for our panelists to tell us a little bit more about their work and their connection to incarcerated women. If we could start with Professor Pasco.
Hi, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm really excited about it and I feel very honored. I think one of the reasons why I was invited is because I'm a former professor of Alex's. That's maybe one of the reasons. And that the other reason would be that I have been studying, learning from girls and women who are in trouble with the law, many of whom end up committed or incarcerated for about the last 2 decades of my life. And a lot of what I have studied and learned from these girls and women really revolve around reproductive rights. And I write a lot about sexualities and such rights in my work. But many of the other themes that Clover and Shawanna bravely spoke about, because we know every time they do, this reopens memories of their harm and injury in their life, especially when thinking about the loss of a child on top of all the other trauma and losses, that there were many other themes that I saw repeatedly in the decades of research that I've done and in the many facilities that I've been in. And then currently right now, I am examining a problem-solving court that is meant to be a last stop before prison alternative sentencing court. And I'm looking particularly how this court treats women and how women, those women who are successful in its completion and are therefore taken off paper. I think we all know what that phrase means. You're finally taken off paper. What are the difference between those women who do not succeed and are usually returned to community corrections, which is essentially in Colorado anyways, a halfway house. Some of them are also having to finish their time in prison. So this is the research that I've been doing for a long time. And I see myself as a scholar activist, because it's not enough just to collect voices and hope people read them, but to put activism and legislation behind that. And I will talk a little bit about that today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Pasco. Professor Baumgartner, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. So I teach at Washington University in St. Louis, and I was part of a small group of faculty members who got together in 2011 to start a prison education program. And it took us until 2014 to get it off the ground for a variety of reasons, mostly institutional reluctance to provide this type of education for incarcerated people. But since 2014, we've been teaching, we've been offering college level classes that lead to either an associate's degree or bachelor of science degree at a medium security men's prison about 30 miles away from campus. I have been, since I'm a women and gender and sexuality studies professor, I've been very, very interested in starting a women's program. One of our main barriers has been that the closest women, in Missouri, we have 18 men facilities and 2 women's facilities. And the closest women's facility to St. Louis is 100 miles away. And the second closest one is 250 miles away. So to try to get faculty to drive out 100 miles there and back is a tall order. That said, we just got some money from the Mellon Foundation, in which we are going to be starting a program at the women's prison. That's the 100-mile away prison, hopefully starting in the fall. But because we started doing a reading group at a federal women's prison that was about 60 miles from St. Louis. And I've been doing that until COVID shut us down, with a colleague of mine for the last 5 years, but it's non-credit and it was a low-level camp. So it was a hard program to start a college program in because their sentences weren't long enough to really get, you have to have somebody there for, 3 to 5 years at least in order to really get a prison education, for them to get enough credits to make it so they can get degrees and things. And in addition to that, I teach a class every spring, a community engaged learning class called Gender and Incarceration. And I'm going to talk about it prior to COVID because COVID, of course, has just changed the world, including this class very profoundly. But in the past, we pair with a variety of community organizations that work with either currently incarcerated women. So students have been able to do tutoring at the local jail, tutoring for the HiSET or the GED exam. They've worked in other organizations that help women when they're released from prison, whether or not that's providing housing and or mental health or addiction counseling. And they've worked in other kind of reentry programs that have helped women. And so the students are really able to see firsthand both what the criminal legal system is like, and then also what the conditions are for women when they are reentering society, and how few resources we give anybody, but women in particular, since they are less than 10% of the entire prison population. There are so few resources that are available for them when they get out of prison. So that's a course I teach every spring. I'm teaching it right now, although in a slightly altered version because of the pandemic.
Thank you, Professor Baumgartner. And Katie Carpenter from the Montana Innocence Project.
Hi, so yeah, I'm Katy Carpenter. I'm the legal director of the Montana Innocence Project. And our organization was started in 2008 with the mission to prevent wrongful convictions and exonerate the innocent. So in doing that, we provide not only investigative services, but legal representation for clients that, or for incarcerated individuals that have proof that they are actually innocent. We assist in investigating to kind of find that evidence, but also then in turn file pretty extensive briefs to be able to achieve their freedom. The extent that I've been familiar with the female incarcerated population in Montana is just in the limited time that I've been here. I came on in 2019. I've been able to work with one client who has been incarcerated in the Billings prison, which is the women's prison here. She just got to pre-release, which is really awesome. Yeah, so I've gotten to see through her eyes kind of what that looks like. I have not yet been able to go to the women's prison due to COVID, but I hope to learn a lot from this panel. I'm so excited. Thank you so much, Alexandra, for reaching out. I am just in awe of the panelists, and I'm so honored to be a part. Thank you.
Thanks, Katie. And I am thrilled that we have Cynthia Chandler joining us, who was featured in the film Belly of the Beast. I found her work to be so inspiring. I think we probably all did. Thank you, Cynthia, for joining us.
Oh, I couldn't unmute myself at first. Thanks so much for having me. I really, when I heard y'all were doing this, I was like, hot damn, folks in the middle of the country are showing our film, and that's so cool. And there's so much energy. So I just wanted to be able to pop in, say thank you. If any of you have any kinds of questions, be available to answer them, and encourage all of you to get involved in your locality and make change happen. And really my hope for the film was that the message would transcend just our stories, Kelly's and our story and Justice Now's effort, and that it would inspire people to know the truth, which is that we all have the power to make change if we all band together and push. And it's really just awe-inspiring to see what people are able to do when they persevere. So that's my hope, that the film will be a catalyst. And so I was really excited to hear that you were all coming together for this panel, and I thought I would just crash. So awesome.
We're so happy that you did. And we have some prepared questions that we're going to run through, but I'd be happy if you would just like to, if you have time, to join the panelists in answering them, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Excellent.
If the panelists are okay having me crash, I'll crash.
I'm getting thumbs up.
Cool.
Well, I'm going to start
Thank
with
you.
a real general question for all of you then. What are most women in a general sense incarcerated for? What types of crimes are we looking at?
Well, I guess I can start. So women tend to be incarcerated more for property related and drug related crimes, as opposed to men who have, who commit the most amount of violent crimes and are incarcerated primarily for, that's the largest category that they are incarcerated for. And so it's, and often the other thing that I've learned is that women oftentimes will get involved in some kind of, or will do their crime because they're involved with a man who has, convinced them that this is a good thing for them to do. And sometimes it's deliberate that they get involved, and sometimes it's just inadvertent. The boyfriend's a drug dealer, and their apartment gets raided, and because of the drug laws, she ends up going to prison because the drugs were in an apartment that she inhabited. So it tends to be those types of things that land women in prison.
I would say in my research with girls, it's a little bit different. Most of them end up committed after failing probation. So probation revocations is what lands them into secure confinement. I would also agree that I see pretty low level, which usually is drug use, but drug possessions or contraband possessions. Usually the chance, once again, will be placed on probation, but it's really hard to survive probation with the requirements for a variety of reasons, having to do with having to pay for doing programming, which can be really difficult on families to pay court fees and pay for the court mandated programs. A lot of times girls have trouble with transportation in getting to such programs, and so then they can't complete it. And then once they don't complete probation requirements, they just linger and linger and linger on probation until they finally do something that's caught and can send them to secure confinement. A lot of survival strategies. One of the worst ones is that part of a probation requirement would be, I see this continuously, is you have to be home after curfew. You can't go out, but we also know that home life can get really turbulent after 5 p.m. When everybody's home and other issues start to culminate. And that's usually when girls want to escape, but by escaping, they're breaking the terms of their probation. We know that girls try their best to feel safe, and safety is an issue. We also know that that's what can trigger PTSD, is when you're feeling safe. And having to use some forms of public transportation can be particularly difficult for girls because they've been violated and assaulted while waiting for public transportation. I had one of the girls that I came to know very well over several years. The way that she was able to pay for and get to her court order program was that she traded sexual favors with her neighbor. And then he paid her too. And so basically a very low level offense, which was shoplifting, underwear that she needed, because that was another thing that as girls become young women, they, underwear is expensive, period products are expensive, and families don't necessarily pay it for them, and there's shame around asking for it too. So they'll steal it. And in doing so, she got caught, and the court basically turned her into a sex trafficking victim by making her do this court order program and using those survival strategies. And so I see that with girls once they become into secure confinement, this kind of long pathway and trajectory in there. I see very few girls who have been in there for violent offenses, except when it's been in concert, like Barbara said, with other boys and men. And we know that the conspiracy charges around gang activity that came up in the 90s in addressing the super predators, which were always boys of color, that we applied those to anyone that was then caught. And a lot of times girls got roped into it, and then you have the kind of equal charges. I've also seen girls' offenses up-crimed and up-charged when we brought police and probation officers into schools. So for example, one girl was adjudicated for assault and kidnapping, which sounds like a horrible offense, but what she essentially did was get into a girl fight altercation. She dragged the girl to an alley on the other side of the school and took her iPod. At the time, she had an iPod. And so she was there for a robbery, assault, and a kidnapping charge, because technically she moved one body to another place without will. So when we unpack those, I mean, that is a violent altercation for sure, but we did see the school kind of react in this upcharging way. So when I look at girls who are adjudicated and then placed in secure confinement, I see a lot of them trying to navigate the many challenges in their lives, as well as a lot of them are kind of parentalized at a very young age to take responsibility for their other siblings and maintaining a household, both not just in the technical way, which can get overwhelming for young women, but also in a more sort of like a more emotional way, trying to protect the privacy of the family and keep these agencies that they do not trust, even if some of them are maybe supposed to be caring agencies, from infiltrating and coming in and intervening in their families' lives. They feel the need to protect their families from that. And all of this ends up that they end up in these systems, not of care, but systems of punishment, which then get perpetuated as they become young adult and adult women, where we see this sort of cycling over and over again. And as Clover and Shawanna said, particularly I see this with Latina girls, but primarily with the Black girls in my study, where their pain gets diagnosed as reactive attachment disorder, impulse control disorder, antisocial disorder, which they're still medicated for, but this is basically code for you need to take responsibility for your own actions. Rarely do I see any thoughtful treatment around PTSD or depression, or understanding that behind these feelings of lack of safety, which can culminate into anger and aggression, is this trauma that they've experienced. And I've never seen that afforded to any of the Black girls in my study. It's always take this pill and shut up, like Shawanna was saying, and maybe a diagnosis that basically says, because we also know like personality diagnoses like these they can translate into the girl is damaged beyond repair. And it gets translated like that within the facilities. And so I see that as what's going on with girls in the juvenile justice system, and that it does, in some ways, then that's the experience as they encounter the adult system of justice as well.
Thank you, Professor Pasco.
Yeah, and I would just, I think that Professor Pasco and Professor Baumgartner also have covered it mostly. The only thing that I would just add is that these problems of transportation, solid housing that you can rely upon, and making those parole officer meetings are exacerbated here in Montana from just the expansiveness of our state. And it's even further exacerbated with Native American women who live on reservations, because getting to a court appointment, getting to their supervision appointments, getting to, if they've been ordered to seek some sort of therapy, whether that be for substance use disorder or just, just having a therapist, it's really difficult to get around. And in kind of getting in gear for this conversation, I was looking up some statistics and I was kind of surprised, I guess, knowing that we know that Native American women are overrepresented in our prison system. But what I didn't realize is that the reason why that Native Americans are also overrepresented in arrests. And part of that is one of the statistics that I found was 27% of arrests are for failure to appear and supervision violations. So when you think about that, that's really not criminal. That's just, poor planning, accident, whatever, or actually just not being able to get things aligned. So we're incarcerating people or arresting people for things that, it could just be explained for people that aren't in the system as just accidents.
Can I throw out a cautionary word in terms of action around these stats, which is that while it's true that a bulk of people in women's and girls' prisons and lockups are there because of survival crimes, and frankly for things that a lot of men and boys would not be locked up for, and which I would sort of term as status offenses in many ways. While that's true, I think it's really important not to overly weight reforms around or center reforms around freeing folks with those lower level offenses. There's been a huge push nationally to sort of provide kinder, gentler, gender responsive jails and prisons to the non-violent, non-repeat women, poor, pathetic offenders, right? And the problem with that is that charging up pattern where people get these high level crimes for lower offenses disproportionately impacts darker skinned women. So the darker you are, the more likely you are to be violated, the more likely you are to have your charges inflated. And so one of the things that folks in California's women's prisons have been really clear to me around is not to get overemphasized on that, because they know, as darker skinned women that have been doing longer sentences, they know that they're going to be emasculated. They know that those reforms are going to be used to subject them to more torture and harsher conditions. And that is the history of prison reform around women's prisons. In the Industrial Revolution, the first prison reformers, many of whom were suffragettes, really wanted to push for reforms which on what were then co-ed institutions and create sort of kinder, gentler women's prisons. But they moved the white women into those institutions. And they moved the white women in to specifically learn to be domestic workers to then work in rich households and serve white people, right? Black women stayed in those men's institutions where they were horrifically abused. And it was part of the sort of masculinization of Black women. And so I always like to, our work, we centered our activism and our partnership with people in prison without regard to what people's convictions were. And in many ways wanted to work more with people with more significant crimes, because they were going to be in the institutions longer, so they would make longer activist partners, but also because usually it was really interesting to be able to connect how lack of attention to the trauma people have endured in childhood and beyond is usually directly linked to then their experience of doing harm and or being targeted by policing. So we wanted to be able to really partner with those folks to be like, what would justice have looked like? What would it have looked like had we actually responded to you in your time of need, rather than put you off and now we're only caging you, right? And so it was a really important way to have conversations about how we could actually more effectively respond to gendered violence in a way that wouldn't perpetuate violence in society.
Thank you, everyone. The next question that I wanted to discuss was, what rights do incarcerated women retain while they're incarcerated? And what rights do they keep while they're incarcerated and that part of their sentence? Professor Baumgartner, why don't we start with you again since you led us off last time?
All right. One of the things that I think about, so people who are in prison have a constitutional right to medical care. But as we saw from the film, and also from listening to the experiences of both Shawanna and Clover, the medical care that they get in prison is so abysmal, and the standard that is set for medical care. I mean, that you have to show a deliberate indifference for harm, which of course is what happened in the. Well, I mean, I thought it happened in the film, even though the jury did not in the first case, but. It's a very difficult thing to the kind of medical care that is offered in prison is just so minimal. And in the state of Missouri, I don't know what they have in Montana, but about 12 years ago, we contracted all our healthcare out. It used to be provided by the state, which wasn't great. But then we contracted it out to a for-profit healthcare provider that offers medical care in I think about 20 prisons around, 20 states around the nation. And because they are a for-profit provider, their interest is to provide as little medical care for as low as costs, so they make as much money for their shareholders. And so it is such a conflict of interest, in my opinion. I mean, not that, again, the state was providing wonderful medical care, but it really took, it got much worse when they contracted it out to this third-party provider. And then so many things that people need and women need while they're in prison is not offered by the healthcare providers because they're not believed. If they do have a serious problem, they're often thought of as making things up. And so consequently, Shawanna told us she ended up blind because her complaints were not taken seriously. And people who have lumps in their breasts will sometimes wait a year before somebody actually can get them to get a mammogram, and then a biopsy, and then, treatment. And by that time it's stage 3 or stage 4. So even though, again, they have this constitutional right for medical care, what is actually being offered in prison is pretty abysmal. So that was the first thing that came to my mind in terms of, what kind of rights people in prison are supposed to have, and then of course what they actually get.
Yeah, I found it.
Yeah, I could.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Just real quickly, Cynthia, then I'll punt to you because I feel like I don't know. I'm just going to contribute a
No,
little
go.
bit. With the on the girls' side, that question's hard for me to answer because, as Barbara just said, that I think of rights they're supposed to have, but when I see them in action, are they actually in action? And then when they're violated, who is there to be the legal advocate and the juvenile defender for them? And that's, so that's really hard. Like, for one thing, on the juvenile end, we're supposed to be providing them education. That doesn't, some facilities respect that, some do not. One of the facilities that the education was so minimal that the girls were actually just sort of turned into the custodial staff for this co-ed type. It wasn't completely mixed. The girls were on one wing, the boys on the other, but they turned it into the custodial staff for the facility. And then I also think that along with the healthcare issues, while Colorado has now changed for the adult women's prison as far as access to feminine hygiene and period products, that is not always the case in the girls' facility. That supposedly they have a right to it and they don't need to have money available in their commissary accounts to pay for these period products like women have had to do in adult prisons. The thing is that they have men are often the wardens of these girls' facilities, and they're the ones that are making decisions as to how are these period products, how many girls need, and which ones could be considered contraband. And for example, in one of the facilities I studied, they considered tampons that they thought girls could commit suicide with tampons, which I couldn't really envision that scenario very well. I guess if you had enough of them, I don't know. But also in the same respect, when asked the warden, how many tampons do you think a girl uses on a daily basis? And he said, well, isn't it one? And this, he had no willful blindness to the education of women's bodies. And then I think, like, if you are offering girls 5 tampons for their entire cycle a month, what are the strategies, and also the sort of shame and humiliation and embarrassment to have to ask male guards for happening in this? And even though it's not necessarily like a civil right, but this is under our, at least, rights that girls should be having these products, this is what's happening. And so it's a hard question for me to answer, because rights on paper and rights in action are often different things.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo what the two of you were saying in terms of there being this difference between what are your in fact rights and versus what's your ability to actualize those rights is huge. One of the reasons in Belly of the Beast, the film shows that we took a legislative remedy strategy to stop the sterilization abuse that we unearthed, was specifically because we didn't think we could win the legal litigation strategy. So it's still constitutional law under Buck v. Bell that it's constitutional to compel people to be sterilized against their will if they're deemed to be basically an inferior class. And but in 1979, there was a really profound early victory of the civil rights and women's rights movements in combination that created federal legislation that created safeguards against eugenics abuses. And under that federal law, right, so it was illegal to sterilize people for the purpose of birth control inside prisons and jails. It says my internet connection is unstable. Can y'all hear me? Thumbs up if you can hear me. Sort of. Am I frozen? I'm good? Okay, cool, thanks. Okay, so so and actually that federal law has never been tested inside the prison context. And so we were like, do we want to bring a lawsuit of first review to test that? And the problem we were dealing with is because of patient privacy laws, while we could do Public Record Act requests to get data on the numbers of sterilizations that were being performed and even who the doctors were and the hospitals it was happening at, we could not get the names of the actual patients. And we interviewed hundreds of people inside California's women's prisons who had delivered children in that sort of 4-year window. And all of them said they were asked if they wanted to be sterilized, which in and of it, while they were giving birth or preparing to go into labor, which is completely illegal, all of them said that they said no. Not a single person said they said yes. And yet our data showed that there were multiple sterilizations happening daily. So more than one per day. So we were like, who are these people, right? And they clearly had no idea whether they were being sterilized or not while they were either going into labor or having other abdominal surgeries. And what we were concerned about with a litigation strategy is that we could do a lawsuit, and we even could do it under a taxpayer lawsuit, because the misuse there was a misuse of it, but the state would have complete control over the narrative and the stories, right? They actually knew who the patients were and we didn't. So they could bring forward the one and only person who actually wanted to be sterilized, who had a compassionate case and reason for wanting to be sterilized, and they would completely control the narrative. And we were terrified that what we were going to do if we brought it in court was reaffirm Buck v. Bell, that we were actually going to set precedent that would allow the forced and coerced sterilization of people in prisons. So that's why we went down a legislative route instead. I also want to say that one of the things we did early on, which garnered attention, it's the reason that the Center for Investigative Reporting even heard about the work we were doing, is we started filing human rights reports in collaboration with people in prison with the United Nations. And the reason we did that is we recognized that US constitutional law is sort of a negative rights framework. It assumes that in the absence of government messing with you, you would all have rights to exercise, okay? It sort of ignores inequity and oppression in society. versus a human rights framework, which demands that people have an affirmative right that they can assert to be protected. And we found that with dealing with vulnerable people who are given very little power and agency, that a human rights framework is a lot more productive and helpful. And so we started training up people in prison. We trained up about 200 women inside California's women's prisons on international human rights law, and they started documenting, and that was beyond the scope of the movie. It's one of the ways that Kelly found us in the beginning, was that we had this huge network of underground documenters. And she used that network then once she started seeing the incidents to bring forward more and more information. And we were able to then file reports using that information with the United Nations. The United Nations sent a representative to come meet with the documenters inside the women's prisons in California, which is really unprecedented. And there was a little teeny blip of media attention on that. And that's what the Center for Investigative Reporting found. So, but for the UN and a human rights framework, we never would have even been able to have garnered the level of political will we needed to effectuate the legislation that we did. And honestly, like if we had gone down the US legal route, we might be living in a world where I would be reporting to you that every jurisdiction was transparently now sterilized. So it's sort of a really important lesson for me as an attorney about what it means to really be creative and not stick to solutions just because it seems like the way that things are typically done. Women who get brought into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame typically are not typical rock stars, right? They're like doing things different. They might be a little bit country, a little bit pop, whatever. Doing that because similarly, if you really want to be a champion for women's rights, other communities that are disenfranchised in our society, you have to do things a little bit quirkier, is my theory. And so I'm a big proponent of thinking about different modes of effectuating rights.
Thank you, Cynthia. One of the things that I really connected with in the film was, I think it was at the beginning when you were getting up at 5:30 in the morning to go to the prison, and you made the comment that they treat me like I'm a child, and so I'm going to start, just owning it. I loved that part. I really identified with that. So I think, what do y'all think about the right to counsel? How is that right treated for incarcerated folks?
So that's actually something that has come up recently in some communications. We get a bunch of applications per year, right? And we write back saying, kind of about our process, and maybe if we have follow-up questions or something like that. And we always stamp them legal mail because they are legal communications. And that is something that is protected. You have privileged communication with a client or prospective client. And this is something that I've seen just in my limited tenure here kind of get scaled back. I've seen not a whole lot, but on occasion I've seen a letter be stamped reviewed by so-and-so, which is a prison guard that has reviewed the communication with my client or my applicant, my prospective client. And that's, something that's eroding away those rights and making it so that prospective clients can't openly communicate their case and can't get adequate representation if they feel that they're being monitored or that there might be some repercussions. And so that definitely is something that comes up, and I'm keeping an eye on for sure.
Thanks, Katie. Did any of our other panelists have any comments on the right to counsel or their experiences with trying to schedule appointments with prisons?
Yeah, I mean, I always tell people that the one and only reason that I continued to go to law school after orientation and I met law students was so that I could have access to working with people in prison. Wait, I think I'm frozen again.
We can hear you.
Here, I'm gonna switch which internet I'm using.
While we wait for Cynthia to get back on, did Professors Baumgartner or Pasco have anything to add?
Okay, there.
I would say, well, once again, speaking on the juvenile end, the Colorado Juvenile Defender Coalition here did a research project not that long ago asking youth who are system involved about their legal counsel, and a very small percentage could even remember getting meaningful counsel. They don't even remember having a conversation. And that really kind of prompted them to do a lot of activism as far as just having the presence, even in the beginning, of legal counsel. And they've had some difficulty too with getting reconsideration hearings, especially for our juvenile lifers. So I think that it's something, at least on the juvenile end, where we sort of, especially, I mean, Denver is a little bit different because we actually have a standalone juvenile court, but when it's in family court, I think that the idea that the youth need their own counsel, it's kind of, that becomes a little bit invisible in some respects.
I was gonna add that I think that, you know, the right to counsel is limited in post-conviction work, and that's has dire consequences for many people. Additionally, though, you know, all people need to have, I think, right to civil counsel. And there are so many ways in which families and communities are ripped apart because people can't access their civil rights in civil courts. And so, for example, like, people's ability to access family law proceedings is incredibly curtailed when they're in prison. Their right to, I mean, really, their right to exercise almost anything and everything is really cut off, which is sort of a form of political death as well. And being an attorney, working with people inside, I mean, I have to say, like, I was really raised as an attorney by jailhouse lawyers, so I didn't have a lot of mentors doing the kind of work I wanted to do when I got out of law school in 1995. And the folks who really coached me up, because there's such a lack of representation, which is a whole other thing, was really people in prison who are given in most jurisdictions an exception to the ban on practice of law by non-lawyers to be able to represent their peers. And those are the folks who actually trained me to be a lawyer. And one of the biggest problems people face is just simply access, like access to representation is so incredibly difficult. In California and many jurisdictions, also departments of corrections are given a lot of discretion to decide that someone is a security risk and just suddenly cut off their ability to access people in prison, whether or not they're an attorney or someone else. And so for about 15 years, almost 15 years, over 10 years, any piece of correspondence that Justice Now sent into the prisons, literally every single piece of correspondence always had my name on it. So if it was someone working under, you know, someone in our office who was a paralegal or intern, it was always under my name. And we put everything under my name for a reason, which was that if my access was suddenly just completely challenged, there really wasn't any way to appeal it. And then we would be able to switch over to a different attorney who had an untarnished reputation. And that's, you know, we did that strategically. It was a little peculiar, you know, like people would meet me and be like, you're that person with that name is everywhere. And I'm like, yeah, no, it's really not me. But you know, we were constantly, I mean, we kept logs. Not only did we keep our normal client files, but we also kept logs on every single visit we did and what the legitimate legal purpose was for what that visit was for, because we were actually pushing the envelope of what we were using legal visitation for, to do legislative work, policy work, which has a legitimate legal purpose, but which we knew that the Department of Corrections wanted to stop us from doing. And I think the last thing I'll say is that, you know, we never guaranteed to our clientele that legal mail was truly privileged. It should be, and they have an expectation of privacy. And the reality is that retaliation happens, and people have their rights violated all the time. And so, especially with asking people to do such activist work on the inside, we felt it was really important for people's safety to always emphasize the fact that we couldn't protect people. We couldn't assume that our correspondence would protect them. And that people had to really understand, and appreciate and spend some time thinking about the risks they were taking and communicating with us at all.
Thank you, Cynthia. So according to the Sentencing Project, Montana ranks 7th in the US for the rate of female incarceration. We incarcerate 103 women per 100,000. There's also been recent allegations about discrimination in female prisons and a lack of advancement opportunities or work training within the prison. So with this in mind, how do we move forward, or how can we make progress for our incarcerated women in Montana?
I'm happy to start this discussion off even. So again, I'm going to use Missouri since I know Missouri and I don't know Montana. In the men and women's prison, well, there are 2 women's prisons. They have incredibly gendered opportunities in the prison for vocational opportunities. So they can learn how to be a hairdresser, cosmetologist, a hairdresser, nails and all that stuff. They can learn how they can take cooking. They could become a nurse's assistant. And there's one other major one, some typing, become a secretary. At the men's prison, on the other hand, they have all kinds of construction programs. So they can become a certified, get the certificate, whatever it's called, in plumbing or electricity. They actually have the truck driving simulator. That thing costs hundreds of thousands of dollars and it looks like a truck, and they climb in, they get all their hours. And so all they have to do when they get out to become a truck driver is actually do the real truck driving with a real truck, but they've had all the background experience. These are construction and truck driving are well paid. Oh, they have an auto repair. So my students are always floored when we actually tour the prisons and they see what's available. It's just so unbelievably gendered. Like we feel like we're back in the 19th century, and kind of what Cynthia had referenced to earlier in terms of the those early reformatories where they sent the white women to learn how to become basically domestic help. It's similar kinds of things right now. And so we are, what we're doing is we're setting women up for these low wage jobs when they get out of prison, as opposed to, not that men are in great places when they get out of prison, but at least they come out with, they can come out with better skills, more marketable skills, higher paid skills that get them higher paid jobs. So I think one of the most important things to do is to advocate for more gender equitable programs in women's prisons. So women can actually get out of prison and get a decent paying job, and they're not relegated to the kind of women's work that we all know is poorly paid.
I'm going to guess that a phenomenon that's happening in Colorado might be happening in Montana as well, which is we not only use prison more often for even low-level offenses, but then we also put away people for a much longer time. And that both those kind of dynamics contribute to mass incarceration, but with women, and we see this with our federal sentencing statistics as well, is that we see more women represented in methamphetamine drug trafficking than the other drug offenses. And we know in Colorado that we actually saw this spike of women going to prison at a time when we were kind of not moving toward decarceration or anything, but trying to eliminate private prisons and use prison less often. We see this spike of women actually getting sentenced to longer sentences, primarily for drug offenses. And when we unpack that, we see that there might be some heroin on board, but it was really around methamphetamine. And I'm thinking that similar phenomenon happens in Wyoming and likely in Montana too, where we see this kind of appearance of meth more often, and that sentencing around meth, we now know that when we look at the drug category that has the longest sentencing to it now with the reforms that happen around crack cocaine, it's methamphetamine that actually has some of the longest ones, at least on the federal level, but on states it varies and there still is a lot of it too. So what that means is that this, in addition to what Barbara was saying about vocational opportunities and training, you know, the experience with substance abuse, particularly around meth, is very difficult. And what we know is that the lack of treatment for sure around substance abuse is in prison, but particularly around methamphetamine is completely unavailable. And it's really, it is kind of, you know, in the work that I do with drug court, it is kind of a different drug in many ways. And the treatment around it is a little bit different too, because unlike, for better or worse, with heroin, we see there's more therapeutic, I would say pharmaceutical, and I don't always like this, treatments that can be available to help with rehabilitation. And there really isn't that with methamphetamine. I'd also say that when women come out of prison, you know, most women are going to get out. Not all, you know, there aren't that many that are going to be lifers. But when they get out, they do have a sort of set of different, their lives are gendered. A lot of them are going to return to children. And if you are somebody that has struggled with substance abuse, sober living facilities that allow children are few and far between. And I'm going to guess that Montana probably doesn't have that many of those, at least in, like you said, a geographically expansive state. Where are the ones that are available? Are you going to have to drive hundreds of miles to go live somewhere to find that spot? And there likely is a wait list, if there even is one, if those facilities exist. So then housing insecurity becomes this issue, which even becomes more pronounced if you can't get a job, as Barbara was saying, that's except a low wage, low paying job. Now, the other thing is that one of the requirements of probation or parole is to often stay away to the term undesirables. And yet, and there's a valid court order a lot of times where if you violate that, that could be you violating a term of your probation or your parole. But we also know that a lot of times these undesirables are actually your family members. And so what are we telling women to do? That one, you're going to be housing insecure because you can't return to your family because those undesirables live there. And the other thing is this is disproportionately used against women of color, these valid court orders. And so it can be a rejection of that. And there's this kind of basically conundrum as not only where you're going to live, but then are you supposed to be cutting off your family? And family can be a source of stress and crisis, but it also can be a source of support too. And so there isn't really a mechanism for family reunification in many places. I know we don't do a very good job of that here with our reentry programs, which by the way, are not tailored to women whatsoever. So I think all of those issues kind of come into play is, you know, why are we sentencing women more often to prison and for longer sentences? But then too, when they get out, are their experiences gendered in a way that's going to set them up for failure?
Yeah, and so for both of your ideas, I have examples absolutely for Montana. As far as, and I sorry, that wasn't meant to be a honest laugh. It was a, oh God, that's so uncomfortable laugh. Is that, you know, when women come out of prison, the geographic location doesn't necessarily have those reentry things that you need. We don't, I mean, the Department of Corrections was actually funded, got a grant a few years ago to put together a statewide reentry guide. They didn't do it. It just didn't get done. And so to be able to have any sort of guidance when you get out as to, you know, where is the local, I'll give you one example in Flathead County, which is a fairly large county here, Whitefish, Kalispell, you know, fairly large. No Narcotics Anonymous classes for a client of mine. She was handed some books and told to sit in her car and read through the books if she was having trouble. And I'm just wondering, like, I mean, I don't know, that just doesn't seem like a good place to make great decisions, is by yourself alone in the car, just white knuckling through some really riveting paperwork. And so that's just one example of how we're not assisting our female formerly incarcerated population to really set up for success.
So there's so many places one can start, right? I mean, there's so many problems just from these examples. There's just so many problems in helping people thrive And also, I mean, honestly, I just want to say I'm also interested in not just helping people thrive. I'm also interested in reducing violence in general in society, both interpersonal and state. So like, there's just so many places you can start. So I'd like to offer up a framework that I've used that has helped me figure out where to start. And so I'm a prison industrial complex abolitionist. So I just want to put that shapes my framework, which means that I can imagine what a safe, compassionate world without prisons would look like. And so everything I try to do is to get us to that point. And for me, and the way I came up with this framework was one time I was in a speaking engagement. And I was doing a lot of compassionate release work at the time, which was getting terminally ill people out of prison so they could die with dignity and reunite with their families. And a woman in the audience kind of challenged me in doing that work. And she was like, I have a real problem with this sort of reformist piecemeal work you're doing. She's like, in a time of slavery, we weren't like fiddle diddling around being like, oh, let's let this one sick person out and act as if like keeping all the healthy people caged is fine and then slavery will be pretty. And I'm like, you're totally right. That would not be. And I was like, but here's the deal, right? Someone had to keep people alive so they could be freed. And who is doing that? So if I had limited resources and I want to keep the slaves alive so that one day they can be freed, am I going to hand my limited resources over to the state, to the slaveholder, right? Which is the state? No, because the slaveholder has a whole lot of interests that are not, in fact, in keeping the slaves alive. In fact, it's the most cost efficient thing if you can like let people hurry up and die quickly and then just get new slaves. So that's not going to reduce suffering. So that led to Justice Now's litmus test that we used for all things. We would always ask whenever there was a new programmatic thing we were evaluating, or if we were looking for some other area we wanted to expand into, we would ask two questions. One was, are we investing in people and not the institution? So, because we didn't want to just throw our resources after the institution, which we didn't trust to actually implement things in a humanitarian way. We wanted to truly invest in the people, right? And then the second question we had is, are we really helping shrink prisons, or are we helping fortify them? Are we helping them justify their existence? And so those two questions always helped us figure out if there was a new opportunity that came our way, or a new thing we could imagine doing, or something that was posed to us, we would ask those two questions to figure out where to start. It was helpful.
That is so helpful. I think it can be daunting and overwhelming to know what you can do. And that's actually the question that I'd like to close with, since we are over time, but we still have pretty much all our participants because you all have been so excellent. So for our remaining three panelists, if you could each just give us some words of advice for our students, what can they do to help?
I'll go. Listen to your client, have a good relationship with your client, and let them guide what you should be doing. Don't ever let yourself feel like I should be in control of this. I should know what to do exactly. I think that if you'll find it in any endeavor, if you have a good open conversation with your client, you're going to get much farther than you could just by kind of with your amazing legal knowledge.
I think in my experience that girls and the women that I've come to know over the last few decades respond well when they're not forced into being deferent, when their anger is understood, and when they're not feeling judged. And I think the advocacy and the representation that you can give for them will be really meaningful if you keep that in mind, that women don't need to be told what to do. Like, we have a lifetime of knowledge. We don't need to be told what to do. We already feel judged all the time and shamed for our actions and everybody else's. And we really want you to understand that if I'm kind of emotional right now, that, women as emotional and hysterical, it's often being used to, one, not want to work with them, and then two, to dismiss what they're really actually saying. So to cut away from that and understand that a lot of times what we're seeing when you have somebody who is angry in front of you, that anger is because of what they're currently experiencing, which is likely abusive. but also from a history that has been unkind.
Thank you. Professor Baumgartner.
So I'll just say that I think that everyone should be like Cynthia and work for Justice Now kinds of organization. We don't have nearly enough of that kind of legal advocacy in our country. And I have been asked by so many of our students to help them find some legal counsel, and it's always such a difficult thing. So you are my hero, Cynthia, and the kind of work that you and Justice Now do, I'm just so amazingly impressed with. And I just hope that everyone, all you law students, are also inspired and go out and do this kind of work, because it is desperately needed.
Definitely. Well said. Well, thank you, panelists, so much. We really,
Oh, wait, can I throw one thing out?
of course. Yes.
So thank you for those kudos. I want to say that, you know, there isn't just any one way, one path to do important work. And actually, I transitioned out of Justice Now, so I'm no longer affiliated with that organization. I gave it over to folks who were more directly impacted once they were trained up to take it over. And I changed fields. So actually now I do work around democratizing the rule of law and training up diverse attorneys to launch socially missioned organizations. And I run a legal incubator in Oakland, California that nurtures for-profit, socially missioned law businesses. So, you know, and people are like, how the hell did you get there? Why are you doing that? And the reality is that I wanted to go somewhere where I felt there was a new frontier. I wanted to really look at this question of access to justice and ask, what would it mean if we diversified who attorneys were and really changed the whole profession of the law? And so 25% of the attorneys going through my program are people with disabilities. The majority are immigrants. Collectively, the folks who have come through the program speak 14 different languages. Like, it's, you know, what it means to really build successful socially missioned businesses is what is currently my shtick, and that may change again, and that's okay, right? I think the main thing is, in my mind, is find something where you can have impact. Find something that you enjoy doing, you have passion, and find something that's needed, right? And if you find that, you find the intersection of that, then you find your calling, and it's beautiful and it sustains you. And if you want something little to do right now, like a little thing, think about sharing this movie, use it to fuel additional conversations. You can go to bellyofthebeastfilm.com and find out how you can have a watch party. There's also a petition. We really need folks to sign it. We're working to get reparations and also the right to be notified for people who were sterilized. So you can see that petition at bellyofthebeastfilm.com. So that's a teeny thing. Do that. I'd really appreciate it. But more than that, just find passion in your life and follow it, and it will be so fulfilling and you'll do good. So thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. This has been incredible, so inspiring and so useful for our students. Daniel or Alex, any closing words?
I just want to make sure that we thank all of our collaborators as well. So it was MBLSA and ACLU and American Constitution Society and Women's Law Caucus as well that made this all come to fruition and were able to fund the film for students. And thank you to all of our speakers. This has been amazing. And I'm so glad we were able to record it so we can share it with students who couldn't make it. We definitely appreciate you.
Thanks for letting me crash your party.
We're so happy that you did. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
That was incredible.
That was good.
Yeah, oh man, Cynthia. I mean, all of our speakers, but wow, what a powerhouse.
I'm going to stop the recording.
Yeah.